Chinese Communist Party has taken its gloves off, imposing unprecedented controls on rare earths.
Why? It's a communist party. They're not in the global system to play fair. They believe in dominating the system.
In this episode, I sit down with Lee Smith, author of The Plot Against the President, and his new book, The China Matrix.
Wow, penicillin and everything else is made in Wuhan. Almost all of our pharmaceuticals come from the People's Republic of China. What will we do?
From pharmaceuticals to critical minerals.
China's a major producer at this point.
Who allowed the CCP to gain such deep control over America's critical resources?
It was simply American corruption that's allowed all of this to happen. And that's certainly the point that Donald Trump makes in the book.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Lee Smith, so good to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Jan, it's always a huge pleasure to be back with you on American Thought Leaders and to speak with you, my dear friend.
You have written a book for the ages, my friend, The China Matrix. Recently, something happened that I describe as communist China taking off its gloves. And that is these very, very detailed international rare earth export restrictions. Mm-hmm. Why don't you lay out what you think happened here?
Yeah. Well, this was in particular a response to the Trump administration's Commerce Department listing a number of different Chinese entities. And as it turns out, these entities, what they'd been doing is they had access to U.S. technology, which they bought, and they passed it on to the Iranians. And the Iranians passed it on to their proxies, Hamas and the Houthis. And in fact, it was found October 7th. It was used in the October 7, 2023 massacre. So what the Trump administration is trying to do is trying to protect U.S. national security from adversarial regimes. The Chinese are trying to help adversaries, or they are helping adversaries of the United States. And so when Donald Trump, the Trump administration came down and said, this is bad, we're not going to let you do this anymore, we're going to sharply restrict your ability to do this, the Chinese said, oh, really? How about if we go nuclear and give you no access to rare earth without having to go through an arduous process? So that's what happened. Jan, the way you put it is accurate. It's like they've taken off their velvet glove and shown what they really are. The argument in my book here, The China Matrix, is that velvet glove was stitched here in the United States over the course of the last half century. As you've been saying here, as your colleagues at Epoch Times have been saying for years, is let's remember it's a communist party. That's what the regime is. It's a brutal regime. It's brutal. It's brutal to Chinese inside of China, outside of China, and it's brutal to all of its adversaries, including the United States and our allies. And it's really Americans who have corporate as well as political elites, and again, this is the subject of the book, who have protected the Chinese Communist Party regime and who have advanced this regime, made it the threat it really is today.
Well, so we were founded back in 2000 to actually explain the reality of communist China to Americans, people the world over, in fact. It's actually been an incredibly difficult thing to do because in the end, it's not that complicated. As you said, it's a communist regime. Human life is not at the top of the list of priorities for any communist party, especially to the Chinese Communist Party, nor win-win relationships with other nations. But how did we even get to this point where the Chinese Communist Party holds control over such a significant portion of the supply chain? And we can use the rare earths or the critical minerals as an example.
Well, I mean, what they did was they can underbid almost anyone. And this is what they did in the pharmaceutical industry. And you'll remember after COVID, people were deeply concerned to realize like, oh, wow, penicillin and everything else is made in Wuhan. Almost all of our pharmaceuticals come from the People's Republic of China. What will we do? What can we do? And the way that they did this with steel. They've done it with a number of what people call strategic industries. And what people mean by strategic industries is if you need steel, for instance, to build ships, and you need it to build a whole bunch of other different munitions. If you don't make your own steel, then you're dependent on what is right now your number one adversary, I mean, there are other countries around the world that make steel, but China's a major producer at this point. We're talking about the same thing in terms of pharmaceuticals. I mean, imagine if we really wound up in a hot conflict with the Chinese Communist Party, right? I mean, what happens with different American soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors are wounded, and they need medication. Well, that's coming from China. So, but the Chinese had a plan for that, and that's what they did. And there were no measures or few measures to protect American industries. People just figured, well, what are we going to do? We can't compete with them. We'll have to do something else. And this is part of what we saw in the 90s when there was the whole idea like, well, we don't need to do manufacturing anymore. We'll become a service economy. And a lot of people made fun of it at the time, and a lot of other people thought it was a stroke of genius. And look, it wasn't just the Clinton administration. There were a lot of Republicans as well. And that's the story the book tells. It's not just Democrats here, it's Republicans. Remember, this relationship started with Richard M. Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who first went to the city once called Peking in February 1972. So some of it at a certain point was honest miscalculation. And at a certain point, there was no way to rationalize it or excuse it anymore. It was simply American corruption that's allowed all of this to happen. And that's certainly the point that Donald Trump makes in the book. And I interviewed Donald Trump at a great length in this book. He has the first word and the last word in the book.
How could the Chinese Communist Party dominate the market so thoroughly with steel? Can you walk me through that process?
Well, I mean, I have a couple people talk about it in here, including a former steel executive, a guy named Dan DeMico, who's really great, big fan of Donald Trump. And what happened was that the Chinese, they just dumped it on the market. It's subsidized, right? It's subsidized by the party. So they can afford basically to underbid anyone they want. And this is a huge problem for the United States around the world, that they can underbid us because it's subsidized. So it happened with steel. It happened with pharmaceuticals. Look back, I guess it was, I quote Mr. D'Amico in this story. It's like, the United States, we weren't the top manufacturer of steel, but we were way up there. The Chinese were way down. I think Japan was on top. And the Chinese just decided they were going to target the steel industry. So they just started producing steel, overproducing steel. And they just started dumping it on markets, and they destroyed, they greatly damaged our steel industry. And they do that up and down the board. This is something that they do. This is not really the fault of American executives. This is something they do. But it is the fault of American political officials who should have been looking at this for a long time and saying, what are we going to do? We can't make our own ships. What are we going to do when we can't make our own munitions? Again, Dan DeMico talks in there. It's like we don't have a very limited smelting facilities. So this is a huge deal. And Donald Trump is the first American president who has brought people's attention to it. There have been other figures in the past on the right, like Jesse Helms, and on the left, like Dick Gephardt. But Donald Trump is the first man who's elected president who talked about China. And he's been talking about the problems with China dating back at least to the year 2000.
One thing I wanted to kind of spell out is that this dumping, the subsidizing you described, that's an effect of state-level industrial policy. This is so there's no independent, kind of steel industry in communist China. No, it's a function of national security policy. And something you talk about in the book, which is incredibly important, which I talk about quite a bit, but I'd like you to talk about a bit to start, is this idea of unrestricted warfare, of using any means as a means of warfare outside of actual kinetic warfare.
Well, General Spalding, who I believe that you've spoken with him, General Spalding wrote an excellent book on this, and he went back and looked at these two Chinese colonels who said, the United States, they pulled off an astonishing victory in Operation Desert Storm, but there's never going to be another war like that, and we're going to make sure there's never going to be another war like that. So we'll just use every other means to make war against the United States. And really, if you look at the different things that have gone on since the 1990s, whether we're talking about the China's entry into the World Trade Organization, whether we're talking about its position in the World Health Organization, whether we're talking about, as you say, its industrial policy, this is all a means of making war at the United States. And you look at how the U.S. has been targeted. economically. The big holdup in Donald Trump's first term, Donald Trump wanted a comprehensive trade deal with the Chinese. What was the problem? Donald Trump wanted an end to currency manipulation. He wanted the Chinese to stop stealing American intellectual property with American companies who were in China. He wanted to stop the forced transfers of tech and a whole bunch of other things, which is just China cheating. And they said, no, we can't do that. And why? It's a communist party. So I think that during that first term, Donald Trump understood what that industrial policy was about, right? They're not in the global system to play fair. They're not in the global system because they believe in balance of powers. They believe in dominating the system. And the fact that, it's not like Xi Jinping needed it pointed out to him that they manipulate the yuan. The fact that Donald Trump and his negotiators talked about this with them, and they finally came back and said, no, sorry, we can't do it. As it turns out, it's against Chinese law. We have to keep cheating. So that was one instance that Xi gave Donald Trump evidence to distrust him. And that's where we are now in Donald Trump's second term. I think it's important for us to realize this. He does not trust Xi Jinping. He does not trust the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you for tuning in to American Thought Leaders. In a world where spin and agendas dominate the headlines, I'm proud to bring you unfiltered insights from the brightest minds in America, from a relative outsider Canadian perspective. To keep this possible and to access even more exclusive content, in-depth documentaries, in our daily digital newspaper, consider subscribing to the Epoch-Times today. It's your way to support independent journalism. Just hit the link in the description below to subscribe and unlock the full American Thought Leaders experience and so much more. You can try it today for just $1 a week. So just hit the link in the description below. And now back to the interview. Well, I'm going to now read, this is the perfect moment to read the president's observation that you cataloged in your book through your interview with him. So this is what he said, and this is looking at that precise trade deal that you mentioned, right? He said, I think you have some very powerful forces in China. President Xi is a very smart and powerful man, but you have other forces that are strong. I saw it firsthand. He viewed my relationship with him and my position as president as very important. They were very embarrassed when they said this to us because this was like having a deal ready to be signed, and the deal was virtually ready to be signed, and then they withdrew it. And I believe that they had some additional forces in China that did not want to. I have no doubt in my mind, but that deal didn't happen. So this is incredibly interesting because there was this, agreement, verbal agreement from Xi, yet the deal was withdrawn, and then this sort of second highly watered down version of a deal came through. I'm going to get your thoughts on this.
Well, Jan, I'm really glad you picked that out because I think it's a really important thing and really fascinating because it gives an insight into what Donald Trump not only thinks about Xi, but how Donald Trump is trying to position Xi, right? Does Donald Trump, does he really believe that there are powerful forces behind Xi that made it impossible for Xi to strike that deal? Or is Donald Trump basically saying, because he says somewhere in there, what does he say? He says, not disrespect, but he said, no, but it's basically that. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but there are really powerful forces there and he couldn't get it done. So is he trying to poke Xi? Do you know what I'm saying? Or is it a combination of all different things? He's saying, Xi's not as strong as he lets on. There are other more powerful forces behind him. So do you know what I'm saying? I think it's a combination of different things. I think Donald Trump also believes, different people told me about that, negotiations for that deal. They said, well, even communist parties have politics they have to deal with. So that's one way to understand it. And that's one way that Donald Trump is talking about it. But I also think that Donald Trump is zeroing in on Xi there, right? He's sensing he's going to deal with him again. He's going to have to negotiate with him again. And what does he want Xi Jinping to know about what Donald Trump thinks about it? So I thought when the president was talking about this, it was super interesting and super masterful. What will Xi make of it when he says, "Oh, so Trump says that I'm not the ultimate power, secretary, general secretary of the Communist Party, president of the state, and also head of the military. I'm not the main power." Okay. So yeah, I'm really glad you picked up on that.
Well, it's very interesting because I do think there's an element of what you just described. I'll tell you what I was thinking as I read this piece, and that is President Trump understands that the Chinese Communist Party, or the survival and supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party, is the number one priority in this system, even above that of the survival of the general secretary and so forth. So the way I read this, right, is I see him understanding that there's basically some powers, let's call it the 200, top families that rule the country. Let's call it the people who have influence in the military, in the Politburo Standing Committee, the Politburo itself. And especially now, as we know that she has lost a considerable amount of power, some people argue very convincingly that perhaps even the military isn't really under his control anymore. These powers are kind of ascendant and, in fact, playing a much bigger role in the decision making.
Well, what struck me when I was speaking with President Trump about this, and later as I started to look at it more, it's like the different things that they were asking for, again, basically stopping cheating, right? But that's the nature of the regime. So Donald Trump is basically demanding, that was his deal. That's what he wanted. The deal was, you must change your nature, Chinese Communist Party regime. If you really want to enter the world system, you must change your nature. And the regime, with Xi at the top, and again, it's unclear what the president was describing and how much he was poking at Xi. But certainly, yes, the Communist Party regime spoke as one. No, we're not going anywhere. We will not erase our character at the request of the American president. Right. So that's a very important thing, I think, to keep in the background, or maybe perhaps the foreground, as we understand the different negotiations and different talks now. That Donald Trump, other American presidents talk about it, right? They say, oh, China must stop doing this. They must stop doing that. And we must challenge China and do this and that. Well, Trump is right up against it. And look at where he is right now with the tariffs, and look at what he's talking about. I mean, the 100% tariffs. I mean, this is astonishing, right? So Donald Trump is actually fighting it, and he understands what it means. I'm certain that he understands what he's asking for is something that the Chinese Communist Party cannot do. And now, as opposed to the first term, I mean, Jan, as you describe and as others have talked about it, this regime is more fragile now than it was 8 years ago.
So I want to jump into the bigger picture of how we ultimately got there, because you chart that incredibly well in the China Matrix. Before I go there, I want to explore a little bit more about this specific particular moment, right? Arguably, this whole tariff regime, Liberation Day, right? That this, from what I saw back then, and I still continue to believe this as I see the activity, a lot of it is centered on forcing China either to participate in the system, the rules-based system, so to speak, when it comes to trade, or suffer immensely. But the reality is that there's this deep economic integration, which again you chart very in detail in the China Matrix. And this is something that was part of the project of the Chinese Communist Party all along. Like if we're gonna have pain, you're gonna have a lot of pain yourself. So here we are. What can happen now?
Well, part of what people talk about, this deep integration. Well, one of the things that we saw during COVID is that those supply lines are again somewhat fragile. That they can be broken rather easily. They can be disrupted rather easily. And so that's why a lot of American companies actually have chosen to reshore. I think that one of the things that people mean when they say how interwoven we are is, and this is a very, very important thing to understand about the trade deficit. When Donald Trump notes that, our trade deficit now since China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, our trade deficit is worth many, many trillions of dollars, right? But a lot of that money, it's important to understand, that's American companies. We're running a trade deficit not only with the People's Republic of China, we're running a trade deficit with American and other Western companies who have chosen to take their manufacturing to China, where there's no regulatory regime. Labor is very cheap. Obviously, there's no protection for labor. And so they're making tons and tons of money exporting from China back to the United States. So that's what people mean in lots of ways when they say so integrated. What they mean is they're making tons of money. Americans and other Westerners are making tons and tons of money in China, and they're very reluctant to let that go. And they have one important card in their hand, and that is that Donald Trump has 3 years left, right? And there's no indication that I think that most of the people who would be running for president from the Republican side appear to be very good on China. Democrats, certainly someone like Gavin Newsom, much less so. But this is what American manufacturers, and this is what Chinese officials are counting on. And that in the meantime, people will throw a whole bunch of stuff at Trump to keep him off balance, to make sure that he's not able to focus on China. And when he is able to focus on China, they'll do stuff like they did last week with the rare earth minerals. But to come back to the idea of the integration, this is, by the way, why President Trump always likes to talk about Tim Cook, why he had him at the joint session of Congress in February, why he's talked about him in the White House, because Tim Cook says, yes, we're coming back, we're investing a lot of money in the United States. So Donald Trump wants to promote that. American corporations that are coming back, moving back their facilities to America, because it's a big thing is American jobs. It's a very, very important thing, getting American jobs back. But another big thing is it's that trade deficit that we've been running with China that's basically paid for their military. And that's an enormous deal. So I think that really Donald Trump's idea of the tariffs and the trade deficit, the trade imbalance being the fundamental problem, I think that's a really holistic way to see it.